Hello friends, welcome to Weapon Technologies. Today we are going to discuss about conventional routing in MVC. So let's start. Before wasting any time, let me tell you one more thing that routing is a pattern matching system for URL which is used to map the incoming request to corresponding controller action method. Right? Whenever the request comes from browser to the server, so and the application is hosted on the server side, right? So the first request basically goes to the global.asx file in which all the routes has been registered, right? And in that routing table, each and every request is mapped to the corresponding controller action method. If the request match is found, then the control will hit to that particular controller action method, right? And we set all these route information in the route config file. We have already seen in our previous videos that this route config file is available in app start folder. In a bit, we are going to do practical in the Visual Studio and you will be able to understand very easily. So don't worry about that. And while using this conventional routing, it needs following parameters we can see on the screen, that name, pattern, and the default values, and the constraints if any required, right? And these are the basically example that when we run our application and when we type in the URL, that's a very normal thing, that domain.com, your domain name, then your controller name, and then accordingly your action method name and any specific parameter if required. So without wasting any time, let's go to the Visual Studio and let's create our one application, so that will make you more clear. So I'm going to create a new project, and since we are going to discuss about conventional routing, so I'm going to give a application name with the name conventional routing, clicking on the OK button, choosing the empty template and going to our MVC reference folder. All the steps are the same which we did earlier in our previous videos. It is going to provide us the MVC application architecture. Yes, so we can see our application, an empty application has been created in MVC, right? Now let's go to the controller and let's add one controller. This time let's name it employee controller, right? Employee controller, right? So we have simply added one employee controller, and let me tell you about this app start folder, which I discussed in the slide. That this is the file routeconfig.cs file we can see on the screen. Now this is a simple class and having one static method with the name register routes. This is the basically main place where all the routes have been defined. We can see one route has been already defined, and this is our we can say default routing. Whenever the application runs, if you have seen in the previous videos that by default home controller and the index section method basically loads on the UI whenever the application loads for the first time, right? So this is the first default route has been defined in this register route method we can see. And similarly, we are going to add multiple routes in our this application according to our need. We can define n number of multiple routes. We can map multiple routes in this method, right? And this method is basically called where, as I have told you, when the first request comes, the first request goes to the global.asx file in this application start method, right? And we can see here we have register route config dot register routes. If we go to the definition of this method, let's go to definition. It is uh, it is taking us to the same method. It is taking us to the same method register routes. We can see in the route config file, right? So whenever the first request comes into the application, the first request basically hit to this global.asx file when the application start. We can see in the screen, and and here is the right. We can see this is the right page or main page where all the routing mapping has been registered, and all the areas and all the bundles we can register according to our need in the application. But at this point of time, we are going to discuss, we are supposed to discuss about conventional routing. So let's focus on the routing concept, right? So let's go to its definition. And in the in a bit, we are going to add multiple routes in this method. So we will be looking after some time. So before we start routing, so let's create, we have already created one controller, and inside this controller let's add multiple action method. Let's name it get employee details. So let's name it get employee details, right? And accordingly let's create two more action method inside this employee controller, right? And this time we name it get employee, and this we are going to name it get employee address, right? So what we have done till now, we have simply created one controller with the name employee controller, and inside this controller we have simply added these three action method, right? And let's create some model also. Model, when I say that means we are going to create simple classes having some few properties, right? Defined inside that class. So let's go to model and create. Uh, let's create one class. Let's create a class with the name employee, right? Employee class, and inside this class let's add some few properties. So to just save the time, I have already copied, and I'm going to paste it over here. We can see, and inside this employee class we have defined few properties. We can see ID, name, class, and the address. And the address is, and we can see the data type of this property is address, right? So let's create one more model. That means let's create one more class with the name address that will define this address, right? So let's add one more model, and we are going to name it address, right? And inside this address class we are going to define some few properties. We can see we have defined house number, address, and city, right? And this address is of type, we can see this address is of, we need to define over here that this address property is of type this address class, right? We can see when I'm hovering the mouse, when I'm hovering the mouse we can see, right? So we have defined our few models also, employee and address. Now let's go to employee controller, right? And over here, uh, in a normal scenario, when we work in the industry, we used to bring the data from the database, right? We used to hit the database and we fetch the data from the database, and we used to basically return that data into this view, and we display it on the browser, right? This is the real scenario that how it works. But as this point of time, we are going to create some dummy data. So let's create one private method, right? And that is going to return of that is going to return list of employees, right? And for using this employee model, we need to define, we need to import the namespace over here. So let's write using the name of the application, and then we are going to use models, right? Now we can use all the models inside this controller. The model name is employee, and now the method name, we can name it, let's suppose employee, right? And this private method is going to return some dummy data, and then this method we will be calling into corresponding these three action method, right? So let's do it. So it's going to return a list of employees. So let's write return new list of employees, and inside this we need to define the all employee details, right? So we are going to define all employee details. So just to save the time, I have already pasted it. We can see this. We have we have created this one dummy data of employee details, and similarly we are going to add, let's suppose 4 5 records, the dummy data, right? So let me paste that. We can see. So what I have done, I have simply created one private method of which is going to return list of employee. The method name is employee, and in this method we have created dummy data. We can see our employee class. We have used all the properties. We have assigned the dummy data in the ID, name, class, and the address. We have assigned all the required properties, right? ID2, ID3, third class, then fourth, then fifth. So we have simply created our dummy data. But in a real scenario, we used to bring all this data by hitting the database, and then that data is particular displayed in a particular view according to our need in the application, right? So we can see we have already created our dummy data, right? Now we are going to call this method over here, right? So let's create, we can say employee, and we are going to call this method over here, right? And this object, we are going to return it into this view, right? And for this action method, we are supposed to create a view, right? Which is going to display on the browser. So to add a view, let me tell you today one new thing. So to add a view, now we are going to add a view with the help of template, right? So uncheck this checkbox. So now, till now we used to create view with the default setting, right? But now today we are going to create with the template. So in this, for this view, we are going to return get all employee details, right? So we are going to use the details. We can see list, because since it is going to return a list of all employee, so we will be using list. And which model we are going to use? Employee model, right? And uncheck this checkbox, and now let's click on the add button. As soon as we have clicked on the add button, we can see this MVC application has automatically generated this view for this action method get all employee details. It has already created, uh, sorry, we need to go to view. So it has auto, it has automatically created all the, we can see all the required model parameters. We can see it has created. So if you remember that these we have already discussed in the HTML helpers when we were discussing HTML helpers, right? And inside this, it is applying for each loop, and it is displaying all the name and classes, and it has automatically created a added details delete link, right? So according to our need, we can manipulate in this view, and this view is strongly binded. If you see that on the top, it is going to use employee model, right? So by mentioning this, it is telling the application that this particular view is going to use employee model on this view. That means this is a strongly binded view, we can see, right? So now let's go back to our employee controller. So first action method and view is done. Now let's create second. So inside this we need to fetch get employee. So we need to fetch the employee detail, and how we can fetch on the basis of employer ID. So for that we need to pass one ID parameter over here, right? And now we can write that it is going to fetch. So we are from where we are getting the data from this employee method, right? It is going to return list of all employees, right? So because we have created dummy data in this method, so we are calling this method over here, and this method is going to return a list of employee. So in this collection we are going to return the uh, return the record of particular employee on the basis of this ID parameter, right? So over here we will apply link query, right? First or default, and now we will write lambda expression, and now we can see all the properties inside that employer model, and right. So we are going to deal with ID, and whatever ID is coming in this method, it is going to compare with this, right? And that particular employee record we have assigned into this employee variable, and now this object we are going to give to this particular view, right? And now for this action method we also have to add the view, right, on which we can display the employee record. So let's add view, and now the same. Now we will be taking the template. So we are going to return a detail of a particular employee. So let's choose details. Let's uncheck this checkbox. And which model we are going to use? Employee model, right? Let's click on the add button. It is going to simply add this get employee. And now it has automatically generated the view for us, and all the required properties in that particular model we can see that has been automatically created. And on the top we can see this view is also a strongly binded view, because it is going to use a employer model for this particular view, right? We have defined at the top, right? So now let's go back to our employee controller, right? So these two action methods have been done. Now the last action method, we are going to return address of a particular employee. So for that also we need to pass parameter the employer ID. So on the basis of the ID, employer ID, we can see we are going to return the address of that particular employee, right? And from where we are going to get the data from this employee method, right? So we will write employee, and in this collection we are going to write lambda expression, right? And on the basis of ID and whatever ID is coming in this method, and on this ID we are going to return the address, right? We are going to return the address of this particular employee, right? And this result set we are going to assign to this object employee, right? And now this object we are going to assign it to the view. Now we are returning this employee object, we can see, to this view. And now similarly the same, we have to create a view for this action method also. So let's do it. Right click and let's create add view. And now this time we are going to click details, right? And now we are going to choose model, this time address, right? Because we are going to return the address of a particular employee. address, right? So let's click on the button. Now we can see it has generated automatically. We can see on the screen, and this view is also a strongly binded because this model is going to use address model for this view, and all the properties we can see that has been automatically binded in this view, right? So save all, and go back to our employee controller. So now let's run the application. And before running the application, let me tell you once more. Till now, what we have done, we have simply added one employee controller, and inside this controller, we simply created these three action method, right? And we have created one private method for creating our dummy data, which is going to return the data for all these three action method views, right? And for these three action method, we have created a corresponding view to that, and all these views are, we can see over here, get employer details, get employee, and get employee address, right? Depending on the action method name, right? So now let's save all the changes and run the application once more. Now it will give a server error. Why so? Let's see. Because it is by default, when the application load, it is going to find home controller and index section method. If you see, I have already told you in this RouteConfig file, a default routing is defined, right? And it is going to check for the home controller and the index section method. But we haven't created any home controller. The controller name is this time is what? This time is employee controller, we can see. So we need to call employee and then the action method name this, right? Or any action method name according to our need. So this time, so let's copy this, and we need to call over here. We can say employee controller name, then your action method name. Now pressing the enter, and we will be looking the data. Yes, we can see we are getting all the name. We can see all the names and classes for second, third, fourth, fifth, and these are the links whatever we have defined in this view. Get all employee details, we can see over here, model name, and then these are the links, right? So this is how this is what we have done till now, right? Let do one more thing. Let's delete these all these links at this point of time, right? So let's go back and let me delete all this link, right? Deleting. Now let's go to the second view, deleting this view, right? Oh, sorry, deleting this action link, and the third HTML also deleting this links, right? Save all changes and reload the application once more, right? This time all the links will be deleted, right? Because we have deleted in the view. So let's see. That is loading the application. Yeah, we can see all the links have been deleted. Now we are having name and class. So now let's go back to the application. Let me stop the application. And now the main concept start. Now we are going to work with the routing. How conventional routing is applied in the application, right? And before I tell you about conventional routing, right, that how it is applied, let's see into the picture that whether all these three action methods are working in the browser or not. So first we have already checked. So let's run the application, and we will be checking for the remaining two action method, and then we will start working with the conventional routing, right? So yeah, so we need to apply. So we need to pass get employee, right? So let's go to the browser, and over here we need to pass first first is your controller name, right? And then is your action method name, and this action method is expecting ID parameter to get the record of a particular employee. So we need to pass that parameter in the query string, right? And this time let's pass it 1, pressing the enter key. Yes, now we can see that we are getting the employee record on the basis of this ID parameter, right? Now let's suppose let pass 3. So yeah, we are getting the record. And now let's suppose we pass 5 ID, we are getting the employee record, right? So we are getting the required data, right? And from where this data is coming? This data is coming from this method which we have created a dummy data, right? But in a real scenario, we will be bringing in from the database, right? But to make you understand, I have created for you the dummy one, right? And now let's run the third action method. For that, we need to pass the action method name, get employee address, and the same ID parameter, right? So let's go to the browser, and we need to pass the action method name. Controller name will remain same, and now ID, let's suppose 5. Yes, we are getting the address detail. And now let's, if I change to 2, yes, we are getting the address. Address is now changing. If I type 1, then yeah, we are getting the data of a particular employee address, right? So now let's go back to the application. Let me stop the application. Now we will be start working with the conventional routing, how it works. And now we need to focus on the routing. Let's suppose let me take you to the URL. Now in the URL we can see that we are passing the controller name and then action method name and then the required parameter, right? But let's suppose we want to return these get employee details, right? But we need to pass in the URL only the employee to make the URL more readable, right? We simply need to pass only the employee, right? And that will basically do the work of this get all employee details, right? So for that we need to define the routing, right? So let's go back, let's go to the RouteConfig file, and here is the main routing, and we need to define multiple, we need to map multiple routes over here. And now the question comes that where we have to define the routes, on the top of this default route or after this default routing, right? So so the question comes here is that where we used to define, on the top of this or below. So the solution for this, that you simply remember like a switch statement, right? How we used how we can see that how we used to work with the switch statement. We used to define all the possible outcomes in the top, and in the last we used to define the default possibility, right? So similarly, we have to follow the same concept here in this routing, that we need to define all the we can say all the new mapping route attributes, or we can say we need to define all the route before this default routing, and in the last this default will be there, right? So yeah, and let me tell you one more thing. We have to keep this as it is. We don't have to delete this, right? Why so? When the application loads in the MVC, so MVC application automatically creates this .axt file. In the application, you cannot see this .axt file anywhere, right? But when the application loads, the MVC creates, we can see that MVC creates automatically these kind of file with extension .axt. So to ignore all these files, we have written this routes.ignore route, right? So we have to keep this same as it is, right? And now we need to define our routing. Now we need to define our we can see we need to map our routes. So for defining that, the same we need to write route, right? The same routes, and then we need to write map route. Similarly, whatever we have written this for default routing. So let me copy it and let me tell you to make you understand in a easy way, right? we can see we have defined one more route, right? And now we need to pass these parameters in the routing, right? That is a name, URL, and default. And these are the same that which we have discussed in this slide, that it needs following parameter: what? Name, pattern, default values, and constraint if any it is applied, right? The same we are using name, URL, and default, we can say, right? So now for this we are going to return get all employee details, right? So let's write all employee details, and let's go to the RouteConfig file, and let's give the name that all employee details, right? And over here we need to define the URL, right? So let's suppose in the URL it is coming in the URL we are going to pass employee, right? And inside this we need to define controller and the action method name. So let's define the controller name. Controller name is this time our, we can see, employee controller, right? Employee controller. So let's define controller name, and the action method name will be this time get all employee details, right? So in the action method, we need to define the name get all employee details, right? So now save the file. So we can say that we have added one routing in the routing table, we can say, which is going to map with this controller and this action method, right? So let's save this file and run the application once more. And now this time we will be passing this employee in the URL, right? And I'm pressing the enter. So let's see what it's going to give the output. It will basically return all the employee details. Yeah, we can see it is returning all the employee records, right? Name and class. So this is how basically we have added routing in our route config file for this controller action method, right? And that doesn't mean that we need to when we have passed this employee controller, it will work with this only. It will work with the older version also. Let's suppose if we pass controller name and the action method name, that will also work, and this will also work, right? Now let's go back to the application, and now let's define one more route. We can say now we are going to add one more route for this next action method. Now we are going to return the employee, particular employee on the basis of ID. So we need to pass in the URL, we can say query string. So that doesn't look good. So for that we need to define pattern in the route config file. So let's go back to the route config file, and let's define one more route over here, right? Hmm. And now this time in the URL we need to define the pattern over here, right? And for defining the pattern we need to pass over here. For this we need to pass ID parameter in the URL. So we have defined the pattern that first of all your in the URL it will give the employee, that's your controller name, because that is fixed in all the action method, right? So we have defined employee, then corresponding the parameter, and for this we need to call which controller action method. Controller name will remain same, and the action method this time will be this one, get employee. So I'm copying it and pasting it over here. It will call this get employee action method, right? And the name we can define, let's say employee, right? Save the changes, and now running the application. So let's run the application. So in the URL we need to pass employee, right? And then the ID parameter. So we have defined the pattern over here, and then we need to pass ID. So we can say ID, let's say pass 4. Now it will give the record of particular employee. We can see it is giving name and class, right? And if we pass, let's say 1, it will give the accordingly the output, right? So this is how we can define our routing in the route config file, right? Now let's do it for the third action method. Let me stop the application. And now let's define route for the third action method, that is your get employee address, right? So for that, let's define one more route. So let copy and paste it, right? And for this, now this time in the URL, we need to pass the pattern for the address also. So remember one thing, the part which is fixed in the URL, we need to define in this way. And the part which is not fixed, we need to pass the parameter at the runtime. We need to pass in this way, right? Right. So, and also remember one thing, that the name should be different in all the while defining all the routing, right? So while define all the when we define all the routes, the name should be different. So this time we are going to fetch address of particular employee. So let's name it employee address, and in the URL we need to define the pattern. So this will be fixed employee, then your ID parameter, and then after that we need to pass the address, right? And accordingly we need to map this route with the this controller and action method. So the controller name will remain same, and now this time the action method will be get employee address. So we need to pass the name of that action over here in front of this action, right? Now save the changes and now run the application, and now we will simply call, let's type employee, right? And then we need to pass parameter, ID parameter, and then we need to pass a then we need to fetch address of this particular employee, right? So we need to write in the URL address whatever we have defined in this URL pattern. We can see employee, then ID, then address, right? So let's go back and now pressing the enter, and now it will display us the address of the that particular employee. Yeah, we can see that it is returning the address of that particular employee. Now if we let's change the ID, if we write 2, so it will return the address of that employee ID, right? Now we pass it 1, it is going to accordingly, it is giving us output accordingly, right? So this is how this is the main routing, right? Whatever we are passing in the URL, so this is how the routing works, right? So in the URL, we can see that this action method, that we don't need to pass the action method name, right? We can simply define our own pattern in the URL, and we can map that particular request to the particular controller action method by defining all these routes. We can see we have defined these 3 routes according to our need in the application, right? Let's go back to the browser. So in the URL we can see, uh, let me delete this. Now if I press enter over here, it will return all the employee details. We can see it is calling the get all employee detail action method. And now this time when we are passing any parameter, any ID, it will give the that particular record of that particular employee, we can see. And now when we want to return the address of this particular employee, so we need to simply pass in the URL address. So it will now return the address of that particular employee. So you can see how easy how it becomes easy to define in the URL, right? And remember one thing, that in the URL it doesn't mean we need to define this employee. We can give it any meaningful name over here according to our need, right? Whatever we have defined in this URL. So this is the main part which is fixed, right? So according to our need, we can give it any meaningful name, right? So this is how basically your conventional routing works, right? Right? Let me stop the application, and let me tell you one more thing that let's suppose if we want to pass default parameter in the URL, right? So we can define the parameter over here in this while defining any route. Let's say for this, we can define over here that for returning particular employee record, we can define default ID, let's say 4, right? So uh, now when we don't want to pass any parameter in the URL, right? So you can see in the URL, let's suppose we don't want to pass in the URL, right? So we can pass it over here in the code while defining this route in the route config file. We can pass the default parameter, right? So it will work accordingly, right? So this is how what we can do. And now let me tell you one more thing. uh, yeah, now let's suppose it it may be the possibility that let's suppose let me enter when I am passing this ID parameter, right? And it is going to give us the, okay, application is stopped, so we need to run the application. Let me run the application first, right? And now this time, let's suppose we are passing ID 3, right? So it is working accordingly, right? But now let's say if any user is passing, instead of integer, it is passing any string, right? Let's suppose any string, right? So how it will behave? The application will break. You can see the application will break. So we need to handle this thing also, because user can enter anything. We can't restrict the user. So how we can overcome this problem? So we, to avoid this problem, the solution is constraint that we have discussed in the slide. You can see when I define the parameters, constraints if any, right? So to handle such kind of problem, we need to pass constraint while defining the routes. And how we can do this? Let me tell you. Let me stop the application. And for that, we need to define constraint, one more parameter. So let's say in the this third action method, when we have defined this route, so let's define constraint, right? Constraint. We need to write comma here, right? And we need to pass over here. We can pass the constraint. So we want to make this parameter integer, right? So for that, we need to pass, no, not exactly this. We need to remove this. We need to make the ID parameter, right? We need to pass the, we can say that we need to pass the pattern over here, that when the this URL is coming from the browser, so it is going to expect it will match this particular regex. We have to define the regex over here, right? For defining that, we need to pass regex over here. Now when the URL is passed in the browser, so it is going to expect that when the ID parameter will be of this type, so it is going to match this regex in the URL. So when the particular ID parameter which is going to be passed in the URL by the user, that will basically match this pattern, we can see, or this regex expression, we can see. When it is matched, then it will call this particular control and action method. Otherwise it will not call. So this is how we can pass a constraint in a while defining any routes in the route config file, right? And now let me tell you one more thing, that in the interview this question is being asked, that is it possible that same route we can define for two multiple action method. Let's say let me copy this and let's define one more route over here. And now this time uh, we are calling this action method over here, right? So is it possible that same route can be defined for the same action, the same route can be defined for two different action method? We can see over here that URL is same, right? We can see URL is same, but action method are different. So is it possible? At compile time, it will not give any error. We can see if we build the solution, if we build the solution at compile time, it will not give any error. It will build successfully. You can see build succeeded. But at the runtime, application will break. Why? Because because the URL is same and the same URL cannot be defined for two different action method, right? You can see same URL cannot be defined for two different action method, right? So this URL and this URL is same, so it is not possible for two different action method. So let me delete this. But a different URL can be defined for one action method, right? Okay, but a single action method can have multiple routes. Let's say, let me define one more route to make you understand. And now this time your action method is same, right? Your action method is same, you can see, but this time URL is different. Let's say this time employee ID and we are passing ABCD, right? Any XYZ, right? And we also need to define the name also different. So let's suppose anything, right? So now this is possible because we can see the action method is same, right? But the URL is different. So this is possible. So remember this thing in mind that a single action method can have multiple different URLs, right? A single action method can have multiple URLs, but a single URL cannot be defined for multiple action method, right? That I have shown you just few minutes back, right? So this is all about for the conventional routing that we have discussed, right? And for this, you need to do a lot of practice for the working with conventional routing, or we can say traditional routing, right? But nowadays, in the industry, this approach is not used. Nowadays, attribute routing are widely used. So that we will be discussing in the upcoming videos. So don't worry about that. And at last, I would say, please like and subscribe my channel, friends, and please share with your friends, right? And let's meet in the next video for the attribute routing. So take care. Bye bye.